Hello everyone and welcome to this session where I will show you how to debug and test all the things you work on when you work with Microsoft Dataverse. But first, let's get some things in order. I want to thank the sponsors of this summit. We have ScriptRunner, GQ Global, Proximo, Redspire, Agilicis, and Hitachi Solutions. Thank you very much for sponsoring this summit so we all can enjoy this free content. Thank you. Uh, First, 30 seconds about me. My name is Magnus Gether Sørensen. I'm from Denmark. I work at Delegate. We're a consultant firm with closing soon around 150 employees. So we're we're not the biggest, but we're not tiny either. I'm a senior consultant there, and if you want to message me with anything, just go on Twitter at XrmWizard. So let's get to the content. So today I will start by talking about test-driven development, kind of what it is, why it is useful. If you've heard about it before, just tune out for a couple of minutes and then go back in. Then I will start discussing what test-driven development and testing for Microsoft Dataverse means and the different options we have there. And that will probably lead to the natural conclusion that you should use XrmMockup for test-driven development. So I will show you how you can do different things with XrmMockup, kind of like a subset of all the features that it has, because it has grown quite a lot. So I wouldn't be able to show all the features. And then a final note on what's coming to XrmMockup, kind of our ideas, where we see we want to grow it and so on. So first, a little about test-driven development. So the idea behind test-driven development is that instead of just writing code blindly and then seeing if it works, we sort of create a collection of tests, automated tests that are run whenever we feel like it. Usually whenever you've written some new code or whenever we want to export a solution or at some point when we want to ensure that our code works. And the idea is that you start by writing a test that fails, uh, and then you write the code that is necessary for that test to succeed, and then you look at that code that you've written and figure out if it can be more simple, if there exists some other code that just needs to be tweaked so it works better, or if it's more easy to maintain. So the steps sort of fall into this. So we start by writing this test that fails to ensure there is a gap in the current code. If we don't have this step, we might write some code that doesn't actually fix anything. And then we make sure the test succeeds, so that gap is no longer there. So now we know that the feature that we have written the test for works. And then the final step, the refactoring, is or in order to ensure that we don't just write code that succeeds tests, but actually write code that is easy to maintain, that follows whatever design patterns you want to follow in your code base and so on. So with that short intro, you can wake back up if you've heard about test-driven development, because now we're going to talk about test-driven development for Microsoft Dataverse. I said it was a short intro, right? So the way I view testing for Microsoft Dataverse, you have kind of four tiers where they are more and more thorough in their testing. So the first level is if you were just any kind of developer, you could call your code yourself. So you would have a single entry point for your logic. So your plugins would just call that single entry point, and you could write any test that would call it with whatever arguments you pass from your plugin. Um, so those would work for any code base. Um, and of course that would be kind of cumbersome, and you could probably get some help. So that is why there exists a ton of frameworks out there, and they help you more than others with trying to test your code. Um, But the good thing about those two is they run on your locally on your machine. That is the symbol for this computer. Uh, you don't need to interact with any kind of real environment. Um, so that would mean they would also run very, very fast, which is something we would need for our test-driven development. If we try to use some tests that run in the cloud for our test-driven development, we would have to write some code, push it to the cloud. That would take a couple of minutes. Then we would have to run the test against a real environment. That would take a couple of minutes, and then we would have to clean up after ourselves, which would take a couple of minutes. So we would have a dev loop that whenever you want to test something, it would take 5 to 10 minutes, and not milliseconds that we would have if we had the test on our local machine. So the shorter the loop from having an idea to writing the code to seeing if it works is better for test-driven development, because we have this loop where we need to write something that fails and so on. But if we want to just test our code and we don't actually care about test-driven development for this thing that we want to test, then there are other options. So we could write integration tests where we connect to a real environment. We simply use the API to act like a real user. And actually that is what some of these test frameworks use locally. The same idea that you are just given a service entry point to Dataverse, and then you can use the API to act like a user. So create records, update records, and so on. And of course, since we are connected to a real environment, that would call any integrations. It would create real data. So we would also have to clean up after ourselves. There are several ways of doing that, and that could be an entire session on its own. And the final one is very thorough, and is really good if you have a few really business critical features that you want to test, and that is UI testing. So the idea is that you record yourself clicking in the system, um, creating data, setting up data, and then firing all the logic that is needed. And then the program you record in is able to spin up its own browser, click those events again, and then validate that everything happens as expected. Of course, this requires some very repeatable examples that you can click through and so on. And there are many ways of making sure that your UI test environment succeeds. There are also some Microsoft Dataverse specific UI test plugins, some browser extensions that make it easier. But if you want to ensure that your business critical pass through your entire IT system, so perhaps you have something that goes through an ERP system where you create an account, it flows over to Dataverse where you do some operations on it, and it flows back into your ERP system. A UI test would be perfect for that. But as you can probably see, it wouldn't help us develop stuff. It just helps us ensure that it works. So since we're talking about test-driven development, we will so the conclusion here is that the local one is best for testing, or is best for test-driven development, and the cloud one is best for testing. Yeah. So of course we will pick the one that is most powerful on our local machine. So of course we will pick a framework. And like I said before, there are tons of options. So if we look into the C# community in general, there is this thing called Fake It Easy, that is used for general purpose mocking. So you fake some kind of endpoint and then you call it and then you describe what kind of logic it would do. So for example, if we call create on an iOrganization service, what should it do exactly? And of course that is very general purpose, and it's not something I would recommend. So like this box represents, there are more advanced ways of doing test-driven development using a framework. The first one is Xrm unit test. It is a very lightweight, simple wrapper. If you have a client that is really strict on what kind of test frameworks you have to use, then this one would be pretty lightweight, and might be something that you could squeeze in there because it has no real dependencies. Um, and but if you want to test something more, if you have some special requests that you need, if you wanted to write some automated tests for JavaScript, then there's also this alternative for fake XMET. Testing in JavaScript is another thing. I just wanted to put it in there because it has support for it. But that is a whole kind of has a whole other story. So here we're talking about testing the backend side of Microsoft Dataverse. But fake XMET has support for all the current requests. Um, it uh, it it follows all these three tools, XrmMockup, Mockup, Fake XMEC, and XrmUnit Unit Test follow the same idea. You're given an iconization service. It has an internal database, and then it creates stuff for you when you call create request. It updates for you when you call update, and so on. Um, so the big difference between Fake XMEC and XrmMockup Mockup is kind of the scope of it. So for example, a queue handler in Fake XMEC just adds to a queue entity, where XrmMockup, Mockup, once we have added queues to that, would enforce all your routing rules, um, would make sure that emails are sent from those queues if it makes sense, and so on. So the scope of XrmMockup Mockup is to mimic your Dataverse entirely. So that is why it also doesn't have support for all requests. It has a lot of requests. It has the basic CRUD and then some additional ones. But it also enforces some your security roles. You are able to specify the security roles that exist on a user and then create a service for it. It supports workflows, and where we will see later is soon it will support Power Automate flows as well. So so that is why we when I look at these testing frameworks, the way I see it is that XM unit test and fake XMEC are really good for unit testing. So if you want to test a single piece of the puzzle, or if you want to test a plugin and see that the logic you've written works, then you should go for that. And the way I view XM Mockup is it tries to be a local integration test. It tries to incorporate as much as possible from your Dataverse environment, so you don't have to worry about it. So the idea is that you have the smallest amount of gap between the real environment and what you use when you do test-driven development. So of course I would pick XrmMockup Mockup and go with that. So let's jump right into XrmMockup Mockup and a demo of it. And just a disclaimer, I use some additional tools to make it easier for myself. I use XM Context for early bound generation, and then I use Daxif for in-code plugin registration. So let's jump into Visual Studio. So when you start out installing XrmMockup, Mockup, you would create first just any test project, whatever fits you need. XrmMockup Mockup is just any kind of DLL that you can call in your test. So for this purpose, I've created a standard MS test project. If you can create it by going to add and then new project, and then you would have a unit test project. So once you have that set up, you would go into NuGet packages, and then you would search, and then you would find this XrmMockup. Mockup. So once you have installed that, you would get a new file locally, or a new folder locally, which just contains the metadata generator and this config file. So of course I have some configurations and passwords. I don't want you to see that. So this is a file that you would see when you installed it. So you would have, like, just to show you some kind of way you could call it, right? So you give your instance, you give your username, your password, Um, of course, now it also supports OAuth authentication and client secret authentication, and any connection string. So you can call it in many different ways. So you're not limited to this old Office 365 connection. Then you would give it a number of solutions for your environment, and the idea is that any entity and plugins and workflows that are in those solutions, uh, XrmMockup would grab those and download them locally. So we'll see that in a moment. If you have some additional entities that are not specified in those solutions, you can write them here. And there are some others configuration that you can provide it. But let's keep it simple. In my setup, I've just added the URL, the password, and my solution, and that's it. So once you run this exe file, it would connect to the environment. It would start getting the entity metadata. It will show you all the different entities that it is fetching stuff for in a moment. So this is of course where you would like to have some nice anecdote. So here we see all the entities that it retrieved metadata for. We'll retrieve currencies, plugins, your organization, some stuff about your organization, some stuff about the business unit, some option sets, the default state and statuses. And right now it's just writing all those files to the disk, and now it has saved. So what you would get is one big, as you can see, it's pretty big. It contains all the entity metadata for all those entities you specified. It generates some type declarations. It's just so it makes it easier once you write the test. We will see those in a second. Then it downloads all those workflows that you have in your solutions, and it downloads all the security roles that you have in your environment, specified for the root business unit. XrmMockup forces you to create your security roles for your root business unit, even though you can create it for sub business units, but we don't believe that's a good practice, so that's why we don't support it. Right, so now we've done that, we can jump into how we would develop. So of course, like a good chef, I've cheated a bit. I have my test over in another environment. It's over here. So I have these example tests. So these are the tests that we will be going through throughout this video. So the first test is to create some kind of simple logic. So whenever we have a contact, we have this field called anonymized. So whenever we give the state where it was anonymized, we want the first and last name to be dotted out. So we want we still want all the data for the contact, but we don't know who it is. So for GDPR purposes. And in order to start creating this test, you need a test base. So for this entire setup, you can go onto the mockup or the XrmMockup Mockup GitHub page on the wiki, and there's a setup, and it explains all the things I just told you. You install the NuGet, you configure the metadata generator, you would build your project so it gets all the assemblies. Then you call generate metadata, and then you define a base class. So that is why I say you need this base class. The idea is that you don't want to set up XrmMockup for every single test. Instead, you have a single test where you just set up your XrmMockup, and then you can call it in all your tests. So this base class here is the exact same that I have inside my test here. And the idea is that you create an instance from XrmMockup, you give it a plugin base class. You can also give it a plugin instance if you don't have a base class. But the idea is that you are able to specify a group of plugins that you want to test. So by giving it you can also give several, as you can see, it is an enumerable of plugin types. So you can give it several base classes if you want to test several things. But the idea is that by pointing it to a specific assembly, Xrm Mockup knows where your plugins are and it can just automatically fetch them. So we will see that later, that we don't have to change anything in this setup for Xrm Mockup whenever we start adding plugins. We also have support for code activities that you can call from workflows. So we didn't work a lot with code activity based classes. So we kind of thought instead, let's just point it to a specific code activity, and then we just fetch all those that are in there simply. And the idea is that you are not able to group them easily inside a workflow either. So we just want Xrm Mockup to fetch all of them. So it's the same idea. I give it this type, then Xrm Mockup can find the assembly and find all the code activities. We also have this enable proxy types. The idea is that whenever you use a context or you have these strongly typed entities, like we have over here, we write new contact instead of new entity. There has to be some additional plumbing for Xrm Mockup to return those entity types back to you. So that is why we have this setting here, because some might work with might want to test some late bound or yeah. And then the final setting that I have here is include all workflows in my environment, because it's a demo environment. There are some workflows that cause infinite loops and so on. So for demo purposes here, I've chosen to exclude or not include all workflows. This would mean that I manually have to include the workflows when I go through and test them later, but we'll see that as we go along. There are a ton of other settings that you can write to Xrm Mockup, and the idea is that you can, so for example, you can give an online environment the same way that we connect using the metadata generator, and the idea is that you can do live debugging. So whenever Xrm Mockup doesn't have any records for that ID, then it would go and fetch it from your specific environment and so on. So, but that feature I will not be showcasing today. So now that we have this, now we will set Xrm Mockup up, we point it to a local variable here, and we call this get admin service. We have two different services here. The idea is that you can specify whether you're calling it from a backend system or from a UI. And the idea is that there are some logic in Dataverse that only runs in the UI. So that's why we have added support for this. Right. So we have this base class. Let's get back to our test, and then we can review what we have. So for this simple test where I want to anonymize a contact, I start by declaring a contact. Then I call this UI service from our test base class. This is just a normal iOrganization service. So I call create on this contact and save the ID. Then I call update on the contact and say now it's anonymized. And then I would retrieve it using this organization service. And then I would expect the first and last name to be anonymized. And of course, since we don't have any plugins in our current system, when we run this, we would expect it to fail. If it didn't fail, then our test run development would have gone wrong. Right? So let's just run it first. And let's see whether it fails or succeeds. So as expected, it fails. It is equal to John and not the asterisk. So we have something missing, right? We haven't declared this plugin yet. And of course, like a good TV chef, I have cheated. So let's include this plugin that will save us. So here I use Daxif plugin registration to have some in-memory plugin registrations. Xrm Mockup also fetches all the plugins in your environment, so you don't have to use this. The point of using this is that you can register your plugin locally and test it locally, because Xrm Mockup works together with Daxif. So you can test your plugins without ever deploying it before it is ready. So you don't have to go through the pain of writing your plugin, pushing it to the environment. Um, and also this enables several developers to work at the same time because you don't actually push your plugins to the environment and override each other. You are entirely locally. So for this example, I've registered on update and create for pre-validation on this contact. Whenever the this registration is unneeded, right? So whenever I update anonymized on a contact, I would call this logic, and I have fallen into this old way of writing logic. So we have a controller where something happens, and then we just call the logic somewhere else. So we just call this function with the target environment, the target from the input parameters. It's an update request, so that's fine. And this logic would simply set the first and last name on this record on the input parameters. So nothing magical. And this works because it runs on the pre-step, so to update the request. So let's see if I have written my code correctly. So let's just run the test again. And see what happens. So first the project is built, and then the test is run. And now it succeeds. And you can also see how fast it goes. Can you imagine if you had to write that plugin, push it, and even if it was the first time, register it as well, then it would take a long time. So with that example out of the way, let's go to something more interesting, because the real beauty of XrmMockup is that plugins are called from plugins. So let's say that I have an entity called child, and the child has a primary contact. And if I anonymize a child, I want this primary contact to be anonymized as well. So in this test, I create a contact, I create a child with that primary contact as a reference. And again, I just use the service from XrmMockup. Then I update the anonymized on the child, and then I retrieve the contact, and I expect the same result as the previous test, because the plugin would just set anonymized on the contact, and then the previous logic that we've already written would be called. Right? So let's run this as a test and see that it fails. And of course, I skipped the refactor step in the previous test because we don't have any logic at all. Yeah, and it failed again. We saw John and we expected the anonymized. So if you were paying attention, you would see that there is already another plugin. I am a good TV chef. And this plugin runs on the post operation on the anonymized attribute. And the same idea, we just take the target, pass it on to the logic. And if this child actually here, I write some code that I haven't even tested. So if I were doing proper test-driven development, I would actually leave this out, because it would only be this thing down here that was the minimum amount of code you would need to write it. But it lies in the hands. It's on the back, right? So if the child doesn't have a primary contact, I skip, and otherwise I update that contact with the anonymized state for this child. And this would of course call the other plugin, right? So let's go back to our example test and run it. Now that we have this plugin in our code. And of course here would be great to have a nice anecdote, but luckily for us, let's see what I missed. Sorry for that intermission. The problem that was that we called this update, and of course my stupid TV chef skills weren't good enough. So in the short amount of time, I spared you the nitty-gritty details, but when we go into this logic, you would see that I've now added that we fetched actually the actual primary contact, right? So now that we go ahead and run our test, you would see that it runs successfully. And of course, you could just trust me that it runs the code that you see. But like it said in the title, we also want to debug. So let's try and see if we can add some breakpoints. So let's actually just go directly into the logic. So let's set a breakpoint right here in our logic here, and also in the logic on the contact as well. And then if we, instead of just running the test, if we call debug, then again, it would build a test project, which also builds all of our plugins and our logic. And then we go into this debug mode in Visual Studio. And we see that we first reach our first plugin on the child, where we have this dirty record. We have all this information. We can debug as we're used to in a regular setting. We see this retrieve and so on. We do the check. And right as we call this update, we would see that we reach our breakpoint inside our other plugin. And all of this is totally local. You didn't have to do anything. You didn't have to tell Mockup that all these new plugins exist and so on. It automatically figured it out because it's in the same assembly. It's the same plugin base class and so on. So all of this happens automatically. Right? So let us skip ahead now that you've seen that you can debug and show you that you can do a lot of things as well. So those are the cool things about plugins, but sometimes we also have some security stuff that we have to worry about, right? So usually in a project, you would just give every user system administrator and then go ahead. And at some point, your system would fail because you failed to test that all your code works for those specific security privileges. So for this example, we will be using the scheduler security role. And before we go through the test, let's just show you the scheduler security role if you are unfamiliar with it. The thing that we will be abusing here is that the scheduler can create contacts, but it cannot create leads. So for this demonstration, we need to test that a scheduler user would be able to do those things. Right, so let's go back into the test and see what I've written for you. So the idea is that for now, let's just skip this part of the test. Let's go down here. So we create some new business unit just to make sure that you have a new one. Xrm, the mockup instance that you create in your test-based class also has a reference to your root business unit. So you don't have to create a new business unit every single time. But for the purposes of showing how XrmMockup works, we do this. And then we call a helper function on the XrmMockup instance. It also has a similar function for creating a team. But the idea is that you give it the service that you want to create, you give it the business unit you want the user to exist on, and then you give it a list of security roles that you want it to have. So here I just give it this simple one, and this is where the type declarations from the metadata comes in, because it just references this ID for the scheduler. And you can add as many security roles as you want. You just go ahead, you have it strongly typed. If you wanted to have a system administrator, then we could give that as well. But for the purpose of this test, we just give it the scheduler. Then we again use the shorthand method on the mockup instance for creating an organization service. You just give it the ID of a system user, and then you're good to go. So now that we have these things, let's go through the rest of our test. We try to create a lead. We assert that it fails if it actually succeeds. We expect an exception to occur. So that's why we have this try catch. And we expect that this exception would be a fault exception with the security fails and so on. Then we try to create a contact, and we expect that to succeed. But then if we try to create a contact for some user that doesn't have any security privileges at all, and that's what this first example up here was. I created a simple user just by creating it through the iOrganization service. And of course, you will know that when you create a user, it doesn't have any security roles. So we would expect that to fail as well. And as you can probably see from uh, this test, it is green. We don't have any logic that would do anything with this. So that is why it would always be green. This is just a feature of Xrm Mockup. So it just works. It just runs. We could try to fiddle with it, but I expect you to trust me. Okay, so that is how you do security testing with Xrm Mockup. Super easy. Create a user, create a service for it. Now, how do we call workflows? So here, as you saw before in my base class, I didn't include any workflows. So that means that I have to use the shorthand method for adding the workflow manually. In a regular scenario, I would expect you to include all your workflows because all the logic that your functional consultants create, I would expect that to be part of your test. Okay, so this waiting workflow here, it is quite complicated because we abused it for XrmMockup internal testing. But the idea is quite simple. It will wait until the account name is populated, then it would update the account, and then it would time out until 2 days, and then update the account as again. And the values are quite clear from the test. The first part where we wait until the account name, it simply copies the account name, so it's there twice. And after 2 days, it would set QWERTY to be the description. So the cool thing about this is how do you test a waiting workflow? Well, Xrm Mockup has a concept of time. So Xrm Mockup has these shorthand for add days, add hours. And the cool thing is if you had something some test that would test for stale accounts or something like that. So after 30 days we would mark them. Then you can simply add a negative number of days, and then you can create the account. Then datetime.now would be now, and then you can test that as well. So the concept of time executes these waiting workflows. It also has an impact on created and modified on and those kind of system attributes. So that would mean that you can test a lot of stuff. Um, so, uh, of course, as you've seen, this test also returns green. So in order to test this workflow, we started out with a null account without a name, and then we add the name, and we expect it to go to this case, right? And then we add 1 day, it's not this QWERTY description. Then we add 2 days, and then we see that the timeout hits. So that is all because Xrm Mockup executes that workflow. And remember, it only knows about that workflow because it fetched them. They're all in here. It lies right there. Right. So we can do something else with workflows. So we have another workflow here. It is super simple. In this case, it just calls this code activity and then it does something else. But the other thing doesn't matter. For this purpose, I just want you to show you that when I go into my code activity down here and I set a breakpoint in here, that I will reach it. So the only reason that it can find this assembly down here is because of this namespace. So if we take a look at our code activity in here, it points to something something and then the namespace of this code activity. So that is why we know that we can call that directly. So if we go into the test and then use debug, we see that we hit our breakpoint. And in the same fashion of our plugins, we would be able to see a ton of things. We'll be able to see this workflow execution context. Not that many of you would ever use this, other than just a way to get some organization service and so on. But we can see the input parameters that we get to this code activity that are defined down here. So we have the input of name, and then I output the double name, the same idea here, right? And it enables us to debug code activities. So that is pretty cool. So XrmMockup has a ton of other features. If you want to know what it currently supports, we try to keep these examples updated. Um, and that leads me to the final part of this presentation, which is, what about the future of XrmMockup? Well, um, we don't try to give any dates because we have full-time jobs. This is not something that we um, do for a living. XrmMockup is open source, it's free. You can use it whenever you want. But it is something we're really proud of. So we want to make it as big as possible, right? So the first part is this Power Automate mockup. It is actually created by a student of Delegate. He created it for his bachelor project. And the idea is that Power Automate flows have this JSON description. So if you can interpret it the same way that we interpret workflows SAMLs, then then we can execute them inside mockup. So what ES does is since Power Automate is a separate part, it would be its own mock, but you can have both XrmMockup and Power Automate mockup, and then you can generate all these triggers and actions that are in the common data service trigger um, uh, based on your XrmMockup instance. So whenever you have a flow that would use some kind of uh, action for the common data service, it would just call your XrmMockup instance and then it would work. So the Power Automate mockup purpose is just to follow the flow of these actions. So it would allow you to create any kind of action, like a OneDrive action or SharePoint, but it's up to you to create this implementation. The next thing that we want to add support for is, of course, custom APIs. Hopefully, they're coming out in general availability soon. Um, but they are super cool, and we want to transfer all of the logic that we have for actions over to these custom APIs. So of course, we want Mockup to support that as well. Then we have some other code that we run sometimes called Azure functions. Um, those Azure functions are also part of our project, so why shouldn't we be able to run them? And then the final thing that is the golden goose at the end of the tunnel is full request support. So like I said, when fake XMVC adds support for add to queue request, it simply adds something to the queue record, where we want to be able to run everything. And I don't know if any of you have seen the internals of routing rules, but they are quite dirty. So it will take some time for us to implement that. So with that said, I hope that you would go on, and if you like this idea, perhaps submit some pull requests. Um, most of our current additions have actually been from pull requests, so there is a lot of support. And that said, I just want to say thank you for your time, um, and hopefully, if you have any questions, just DM me on Twitter. Thank you. Bye.